The Catalina Terminal at Wilmington, California, a Saturday morning in July 1942. Rosa Morales, 38, stood at the edge of the dock with her daughters Carmen and Elena and looked at the space where the Catalina was supposed to be. The dock was not empty in the way a dock is empty when a boat has not yet arrived. It was empty in the way a dock is empty when the boat is not coming, when it has been removed, repurposed, renamed, and is at this moment approximately 400 miles north doing a different job entirely. The Catalina Island steamship line sign was still posted. The ticket window was still there. Somewhere behind the window, Rosa understood without checking, there were still printed timetables with departure times that would not apply this summer, or the next, or the next. Carmen had been talking about the Catalina crossing since February. She was 13 now, and the bow rail spot she had claimed every summer since she was 7 was, at this particular moment in July 1942, somewhere in San Francisco Bay, carrying soldiers to ships that were going across the Pacific. The island itself was closed. The government had requisitioned the ship in August, not yet in July, though the closure was coming, and what had been, for Carmen's entire memory of summer, the specific smell of diesel and salt and the Pacific spray off the bow, was now a dock on a Saturday morning with no boat and an island she could not reach. Rosa did not explain this to Carmen in any detail. Carmen was 13. She had heard the radio. She understood that the Catalina was doing something more important than taking her to Avalon for the day. What she had not yet understood, what no one standing at a closed ticket window at the Wilmington Terminal in July 1942 could have understood without access to the San Francisco Port of Embarkation's operating records, was what the ship she had grown up crossing on would become before it came back. What did a 301-foot pleasure steamer built for leather settees and big bands and families tossing coins into Avalon Harbor become in 44 months that made it the single most used troop transport in the history of the United States Army? To understand what the U.S. Army acquired on August 25, 1942, when it requisitioned the SS Catalina from the Wilmington Transportation Company and redesignated her FS-99, you need to understand what it was taking. The SS Catalina, the Great White Steamer, had been built in 1924 at a cost of $1 million for William Wrigley, Jr., who owned Santa Catalina Island and intended the crossing to it to feel, for the 2.5 hours it took, like the beginning of something rather than the inconvenience before it. The result was a 301-foot white-hulled vessel with leather settees in the main saloon, gleaming teak throughout, a ballroom with a full-size dance floor, and an upper deck where a live orchestra played through the crossing. She could carry 2,000 passengers at a time. She had been doing this since 1924 without interruption, 9 months a year, 6 departures daily, 26 miles each way across the San Pedro Channel, arriving in Avalon to the specific welcome that Catalina Island had built around the arrival of this specific ship, speedboats circling, water skiers cutting through the wake, children swimming out from shore to dive for coins. The residents of Avalon gathered at the dock and sang as passengers walked off the gangway. By 1929, the Catalina and her 2 running mates, the Avalon and the Cabrillo, were making 10 round trips daily combined, carrying 500,000 passengers between the Port of Los Angeles and Avalon Harbor in a single year. The Army did not requisition a military vessel. It requisitioned a dance boat, a family boat, a boat children had been playing hide-and-seek in among the lifeboats since it was launched, a boat that had been, until the August morning in 1942, when its hull was painted gray, the most beloved excursion steamer on the Pacific coast of the United States. What did the U.S. Army's specific need, ferrying soldiers to embarkation ships in San Francisco Bay, thousands of soldiers at a time, in conditions that required nothing more elaborate than getting them from one pier to another before they sailed for the Pacific, have to do with what the Great White Steamer had been built to provide? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the American excursion boat trip between 1900 and 1980. What the steamer actually offered, what the crew and the regular passengers built into the trip over years of repetition, and what families were actually getting from time on the water that the destination on either end could not give them alone. Not nostalgia for an old photograph of a steamer. The documented social meaning of a trip that a generation of American families built into their summers on purpose. Even if you never crossed to Catalina, what a pleasure steamer built for big bands and coin divers did in 44 months of wartime, and what it went back to doing the summer after, is one of the stranger and more specific stories American maritime history has. And if your family ever rode the SS Catalina, put it in the comments. Did your family take the Catalina before the war, after it, or both? And do you remember the crossing feeling different once the ship came back? Next time on this channel, the Puget Sound Mosquito Fleet, the small ferries that carried an entire Washington state region to work every morning until a single bridge ended them all. From August 25, 1942, the date the Army took possession, until April 22, 1946, the vessel that families had crossed to Catalina Island on for 18 consecutive years served as U.S. Army FS-99 at the San Francisco port of embarkation. Her specific assignment was not an ocean crossing. She did not carry soldiers across the Pacific. She ferried them, run after run, day after day, in the bay's protected waters, from the embarkation camps scattered around San Francisco Bay to the departure piers where the large Pacific Theater transports were waiting. She was the last American vessel most of those soldiers stepped onto before they boarded the ships that would take them to war. The leather settees were still aboard. The teak woodwork was behind the gray military paint. The ballroom floor, the one the big bands had played over on the Catalina summer crossings, was still there. The lifeboat davits where children had run their hide-and-seek routes every summer for 18 years were still there. None of it was visible under the Army's gray, and none of it was relevant to a soldier boarding FS-99 with his full pack in San Francisco Bay in 1943. What mattered was that the vessel could carry 2,500 troops at a time, that she ran reliably in the bay's waters, and that she had a civilian crew of 39 officers and men who knew exactly how to move large numbers of people quickly from one pier to another. The ship that had been built to give Southern California families 2.5 hours of unhurried Pacific crossing, the bow rail, the spray, the orchestra, the coin divers at Avalon, was now the most efficient human-moving machine at the most critical embarkation port in the Pacific Theater. In 44 months of Army service, she moved 820,000 soldiers and other military personnel. More than any other Army transport in the United States' history of moving men to war. What did the specific fact, a pleasure steamer built for coin divers in Avalon Harbor, now the single most used troop ferry in American military history, reveal about what made a ship effective at moving large numbers of people that neither the Army nor the Steamship Historical Society had specifically designed for? The number was not an objective that the U.S. Army set out to reach with FS-99. It accumulated the way operational records accumulate when a vessel is good at a specific, defined job and is given no reason to stop doing it. From August 1942 to April 1946, 44 months, the Army's FS-99 ran without significant interruption at the San Francisco port of embarkation, ferrying soldiers from their Bay Area camps to the departure piers where the ocean transports were loading. She was reliable, she was fast enough for the bay's waters, she could carry 2,500 troops at a time, and the Army had no reason to replace her with anything larger or more elaborate when she was already the most efficient vessel on the route. The specifics of her final days of Army service tell their own story about what the record meant in practice. In the last week before she was returned to civilian use in April 1946, FS 99 transported 12,764 Army personnel, her single busiest week in 44 months. The Army did not reduce her workload as the war wound down. It increased it. The Pacific theater was ending. Soldiers were returning in large numbers through the same San Francisco port where they had shipped out, and FS 99 was moving them in the same direction again, from the ocean transports to the shore, until the very last day of her military service. When the Steamship Historical Society of America documented the SS Catalina's full career later, civilian and military combined, the figure that resulted was 25 million total passengers. Combined with the 820,000 military personnel, the organization's assessment was specific. The Catalina had carried more passengers than any other vessel anywhere in the recorded history of maritime travel. The ship that built this record was a pleasure steamer. It had leather settees. It had a ballroom. Children had played hide-and-seek in its lifeboat davits for 18 summers before the Army painted it gray. What does it mean for the families who had built their summers around this specific crossing that the same 2,000-passenger dance boat they had ridden to Avalon was also, in 44 months of wartime, the most used military transport in American history? Before you can understand the specific irony of the SS Catalina's wartime record, you need to understand how military intelligence in the Pacific Theater thought about transport capability. A threat assessment in 1943 looked at naval vessels by tonnage, firepower, and ocean crossing range. The Imperial Japanese Navy's order of battle accounted for destroyers, cruisers, battleships, aircraft carriers, submarines, and the large ocean-going troop ships that moved forces across strategic distances. It did not, as a category, account for the specific logistical problem that the United States had at the San Francisco port of embarkation. The challenge of moving 2,500 soldiers at a time from a Bay Area camp to an ocean pier, repeatedly, in all weather, without interruption, for 44 months. The vessel solving that problem was a 2.5-hour pleasure steamer painted gray. It had a dance floor and a ballroom and leather settees. It had been built with an orchestra deck and a coin dive tradition and a specific arrival ritual that the entire town of Avalon had organized its summers around. Nothing in any Japanese strategic assessment of American Pacific Theater capabilities would have included the SS Catalina in its calculations, because nothing in the taxonomy of naval power or ocean transport that those assessments were built around would have identified a 2,000-passenger family excursion boat as a strategic military asset, and yet she was. The 820,000 soldiers she moved through San Francisco Bay were soldiers who went to the Pacific, who fought across the island campaigns, who were on the ships at Leyte Gulf and Iwo Jima and Okinawa. FS 99 was the last American soil they stood on, the last American ship they boarded before the ocean transports took them to war. The ship that could not be identified as a military threat because it was a pleasure steamer was, in the specific, documented calculus of the San Francisco port of embarkation, among the most effective instruments the United States had for moving the force that won the Pacific campaign. What does it reveal about military logistics and about what made the SS Catalina so specifically effective at her wartime job, that the most used U.S. Army transport of World War II was a ship the enemy would never have looked for because it looked like a dance boat? On July 3, 1946, the SS Catalina returned to her peacetime route. The Army had given her back 10 weeks earlier, on April 22nd, and the Wilmington Transportation Company had spent those 10 weeks removing the military gray and putting the white back, restoring the civilian markings, and making the deck that 820,000 soldiers had stood on with their full packs into the deck that families would stand on again with their picnic hampers and their claim to the bow rail. Rosa Morales came back to the Wilmington terminal that July. Carmen was 17 now. The ticket window was open. The departure board showed times that were real, and the ship at the dock was white again, visibly, recognizably the same vessel that had been there before the war, with the same deck layout and the same rail positions and the same lifeboat davits where Carmen had run as a child. Carmen stood at the bow rail in the same spot she had always claimed. She had not been in this position for 4 years. The spray came off the bow the same way. The San Pedro Channel chop felt the same way. The specific quality of the Pacific air over open water, the coolness that no August afternoon in the city produced, was the same. The ship's whistle sounded the departure the same way it always had. What was different was invisible. None of the passengers who boarded at Wilmington on July 3, 1946, knew, in specific terms, that the deck they were standing on had supported 820,000 soldiers in the 44 months they had been unable to board. None of them had access to the Army's embarkation records. What they knew was what was visible. The ship was white again, the ticket window was open, and the bow rail was exactly where it had always been. What had the ship become, in 44 months, that its regular passengers knew only from the outside? And what did it mean to bring 820,000 soldiers' worth of wartime use back to the same crossing that a girl had first made at 7 years old and not been able to make for 4 years? The number the Steamship Historical Society of America eventually documented, more passengers than any other vessel anywhere, was not a single crossing's worth of arithmetic. It was the ledger of a ship that had run the same 26-mile route 9,807 times across 51 years. The civilian crossings before the war, the 820,000 soldiers of the wartime service, and then the civilian crossings again, year after year, from 1946 until September 14, 1975, when the SS Catalina made her last departure from Wilmington and her last arrival in Avalon, and came back to tie up at Pier 3 for the final time. The post-war years were not seamless. By 1950, more than 115,000 passengers were still crossing annually. The post-war boom in the Catalina run, families returning to the ritual they had put on hold for 4 years. But by 1956, that figure had fallen to just over 41,000. The Pacific Electric Big Red Car trolley service that had connected downtown Los Angeles to the Wilmington terminal since 1920 stopped its Catalina service in 1958. Smaller, faster ferries began taking a share of the crossing traffic, covering the 26 miles in under an hour rather than 2.5. By the mid-1960s, the SS Catalina was competing, increasingly unequally, against vessels that had been designed to do the crossing faster. She did not lose the competition because she failed. She lost it because the families who had once brought their children to the bow rail and explained without words that the crossing was. The point had become, slowly, families who had other options. The record, 9,807 crossings, 25 million passengers, the single most used Army transport in American history, was not achieved by any single dramatic moment. It was achieved by doing the same thing, reliably, over 51 years, in all weather, without asking to be considered historic. What does it mean that the most documented achievement in the history of American passenger shipping, more passengers than any vessel anywhere, belonged to a ship whose entire purpose, for 51 years, was to make a single 26-mile crossing feel like the beginning of something rather than just the way you got there? Carmen Morales crossed to Catalina Island for the last time on the SS Catalina in the summer of 1974, the summer before the ship's final season. She was 44 years old. The crossing still took 2.5 hours. The bow rail was where it had always been. She stood at it without explaining to herself why she stood there rather than in the saloon, because after 35 years of standing at it, the explanation had become the standing itself. What the SS Catalina gave Carmen Morales, across 35 years of crossings interrupted by 4 years of wartime closure, was not primarily the destination. Avalon had changed in 35 years. The Wrigley family's specific vision of the island had evolved. Faster ferries had reduced the crossing to under an hour for passengers who chose them. What had not changed in 35 years was the specific, documented, 26-mile fact of the San Pedro Channel between the Port of Los Angeles and Avalon Harbor, and the specific documented physics of a 301-foot vessel crossing it. The spray off the bow was the same spray. The Pacific wind over open water was the same wind. The bow rail was the same rail. The ship that had carried more passengers than any other vessel in history, that had ferried 820,000 soldiers to the Pacific and then come back to doing the same bow rail in the same 2.5 hours, ended her working life on September 14, 1975. She became a floating discotheque. She ran aground in Ensenada Harbor in 1997. She was scrapped in 2009. The bow rail knew what to do with a 7-year-old girl who first stood at it in 1936. It knew what to do with the same girl, 17, in 1946 when the ship came back white. It knew what to do with her at 44 in 1974, the summer before the last season. No Army embarkation record and no faster ferry schedule had ever thought to account for what was at stake at that rail. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the American excursion boat trip meant to the families who chose it summer after summer, subscribe. There are more steamers, more island crossings, more evening cruises, and more crowded departure docks that were the best 2 hours of somebody's whole summer and were never described that way at the time because they didn't need to be. Even if you never crossed to Catalina, what a pleasure steamer built for big bands and coin divers did in 44 months of wartime, and what it went back to doing the summer after, is one of the stranger and more specific stories American maritime history has. And if you have a memory of a Catalina crossing before the war, after it, or both, put it in the comments. Did your family take the SS Catalina, and do you remember the crossing feeling different once the ship came back?